My old man, he didn't help at all, my old man. We used to play tag and he'd drive. I mean, I had it rough. Well, I told my old man I'm sick and tired of running around in circles. He got mad. He nailed down my other foot. My old man, he didn't help either. The time I was kidnapped, they sent back a piece of my finger. He said he wanted more proof. I mean, it was the same thing when I was a kid. No respect. My old man told me Mickey Mouse died in a cancer experiment. My old man, he didn't help either. Kept taking me to the zoo. He said he was hoping my real parents would claim me. My old man, he didn't like my looks either. But he carried around a picture of the kid who came with the wallet. I mean, are you kidding? My old man never liked me. When he took me hunting, he gave me a 3-minute head start.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, October the 12th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Ron DeSantis, Nonprofit News Now, My Take, Israeli War, Rules for Retrogrades, Rules for Patriots, The Rape of the Mind, No Free Lunch, Rodney Dangerfield, Ayn Rand Quote, Bishop-Barron, and the latest installment of Inside Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now we will have There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen, 250 Economic Truths.
Properly understood, the case for capitalism is not a case for license or for laissez-faire. It is a case for national wealth as a moral good, for the interest of the mass of consumers as the guide of policy, for clear and uniform rules of competition imposed upon all, for letting markets set prices, letting buyers make choices, and letting producers experiment, innovate, and make what they think they can sell, all while protecting consumers and punishing abuses. It is a case for avoiding concentrations of power, for keeping business and government separate, and for letting those who can meet their own needs do so. It is a case for humility about our ability to know, and therefore about our capacity to do. Yuval Levin. Each of the moral aspirations we hope for about our society and each of the economic objectives we have in a free enterprise economy are undermined by an overly cozy relationship with business and government, where the coercive power of the state is allowed to pick winners and losers. Our case for a market economy is a noble one, but it is undermined from start to finish when we fail to condemn the insidious effects of crony capitalism.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
The concept of treason. Before looking into the subject further, let us make an inquiry into the meaning of the word treason. It is, after all, used in a confusing variety of senses. The word treason has many social and political implications, and the customs, habits, and mores of the group in which it is used affect the color and its meaning. The word itself is derived from the Latin tradere or transdere, to deliver wrongfully, to betray, to give something across, to give loyalty and secrets away. But from this root, the word has acquired a variety of meanings. In the first place, it has a purely emotional, individual meaning related to feelings of deprivation and injustice. The infant often experiences all that compels him out of his state of bliss and dependency, which means the very act of growing up, as a betrayal, and sees treason in which he considers rejection by his parents. The person who retains these infantile feelings in his adult life may react to every fancied slight or rejection as an act of treason or betrayal. Lack of solidarity with the family or clan, with the in-group, not conforming to its rituals and taboos, has often been interpreted by the group as treason through dissent. In this sense, the word implies a primitive moral evaluation. Disgust and contempt are associated with it. Treason indicates something deeply emotional, something taboo, something different or strange, like allegiance to an alien ideology, a breach of traditions, or the simple fact of being a foreigner. Rejection of the norms and rules of the community, being one's own judge of morality and ethics, is often considered treasonable. Utter rejection of the traditions of one's fatherland is an extreme. Often, simple nonconformity may be considered treasonable too. Indeed, in totalitaria, nonconformity and dissent are the most serious crimes against the system, and totalitarian minds have a tendency to look upon even honest mistakes or differences of opinion as deliberate treachery. Because of its deep emotional content, the very word itself can be used as a political tool with which to manipulate people. In totalitaria, it becomes merely a Pavlovian sign, triggering off reactions of distrust and hatred. After a military defeat or a diplomatic disappointment, or whenever feelings of humiliation and inadequacy run high among the people, it is useful strategy to get them to project their sense of inferiority onto others. The traitor is, in such a case, an easy scapegoat who satisfies the collective need to project blame and to relive unconscious anxiety. In a totalitarian society, every citizen is compelled to become a traitor, according to our own Western sense of decency, because it is his duty to betray to the regime every expression of dissension or rebellion. The child has to report his father, the father his child. They are even called traitors in the totalitarian sense as soon as they fail to report. In the common political interpretation, treason is an act of rebellion, sedition, schism, heresy, conspiracy, or subversion. Its technical juridical meaning is well known to everybody. Treason is adhering to enemies and giving aid and comfort to them. It is also, in a more modern, modified sense, taking part in an international ideological conspiracy against the fatherland. To me, as a psychiatrist, its relation to the general problem of self-betrayal is the key to an understanding of the word. The germ of treason arrives first in the individual's compromises with his own principles and beliefs. After these initial compromises have been made, it becomes easier to go on, to make more and more promises until finally the compromiser may become the man who is willing to sell himself and his services to the highest bidder. During the Nazi occupation, we saw this among those who were seduced to do little services for the enemy. The first step led to the second, and then to the final collaboration. It is because all of us do doubt ourselves from time to time, because we are unsure of what we would do if we were put to the test, and because we may see in ourselves a potential traitor, that the word treason has such highly emotional appeal. But self-doubt is a far cry from actual treason. The real traitor, in the morbid sense of the word, is not merely a self-doubter. He is a man who believes only in the ultra-personal rights and who scorns the rights and wishes of the community. He is disloyal, even to his own gang. Hitler, for example, was a traitor not only to his own ideals, handling them as changeable tools to help him gain and maintain power. He was repeatedly a traitor to his closest friends and collaborators, many of whom he betrayed and murdered in 1934 during what has been called the Night of the Long Knives. The real traitor is a person with egocentric delusions and conscious conviction that he alone is right. He's a very different type from the involuntary, pathetic, unaware traitor, like our little barber.
So that was The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, MD, the concept of treason. And he goes ahead and defines treason or pretends to define it. He doesn't really define it because he came up with 6 different words to define treason. So he failed to define it. But it's easy to be intimidated because he has MD after his name or because he's written a book. So when your conscience says, I don't know, something about that definition really doesn't sound right, it's easy to say to yourself, well, what do I know? I'm not a published author. I'm not a doctor. Don't be intimidated. Doctors make mistakes. Authors make mistakes. Trust your conscience. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades, 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 35. Retrogrades will never be able to profitably wield divisive group politics. As the One Ring of Power from Tolkien's Middle-earth answers only to Sauron, divisive group politics, the system of political grievance-mongering and favoritism based on race, sex, protected class, can only deftly be wielded by wicked men, by radicals. Splintering and factionalizing men, turning brother against brother, is hateful connivance. Branding people indelibly with a prefabricated identity and de-individualizing them due to a singular attribute is an affront to human dignity. It's an affront to free will. Good men cannot, without losing their souls in the process, embrace such a disordered method. There's no such thing as a man that's wicked in only one respect, since gravely disordered conduct, in a particular instance, is a mere symptom of a more fundamental problem with the will. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. James 2:10. So by definition, the retrograde has no recourse to divisive group politics. The minute he attempts to wield them, he ceases to be a retrograde, just like men who die wearing one of the rings forged by Sauron cease to be men and become wraiths. Application bears out the foolishness of any retrograde dalliances with divisive group politics. First of all, impelled as retrogrades are to refrain from doing evil so that good may come of it, they will always be at comparative disadvantage with wicked men who are willing to employ unscrupulous political stratagems in furtherance of crooked ends. So, even in the event that the retrograde takes leave of his senses to the point where he contemplates exploring the gloomy method of race, sex, protected class pandering, he will not be able to wield such politics to the fullest extent, his hand being stayed by his lingering sense of compunction. In other words, he will never be able to out-radical radicals. We'll never be able to pay a higher ransom for votes than they. Radicals are not hamstrung by ethics in their methods, the way retrogrades are. For radicals, the ends justify the means. Putting aside for now the tension of the following hypotheticals with constitutionalism, subsidiarity, and justice, let's suppose that the retrograde were, in an effort at ingratiation to offer to black Americans reparations for the horrors of slavery. Radicals, being unmoored from moral concerns, would simply offer greater reparations. Supposing retrogrades offered a generous package of welfare benefits to illegal immigrants, radicals would simply offer more welfare benefits. Supposing retrogrades offered guaranteed paid maternity leave for working mothers, radicals would simply offer more paid leave. And if retrogrades should attempt to keep pace with radicals in their purchasing of allegiance, then we will have become, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from the very ideologues that we claim to oppose. We cannot afford to try to beat radicals at their own cynical game. To do so would mean forfeiting our souls and conceding the very principles that make our movement great. Neither may we have recourse to the twin swords of despair and envy, which play an integral role in advancing divisive group politics. The diabolical logic behind radicals' adherence to the politics of despair and envy is rather plain. We clearly live in a pluralistic society, one composed of numerous race, sex, protected class groups with varying interests. So, if radicals can convince a sufficient number of such groups that their interests are in conflict and competition with the interests of one collective bogeyman, i.e., the much maligned straight white male, then radicals can create an artificial cohesion between the various race, sex, protected class groups by mobilizing them against the bogeyman group. It's the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If radicals can convince the race, sex, protected class groups that they're dedicated to serving the group's interests, then the groups will have been consolidated into a dependable radical voting bloc. If the membership in the groups eventually eclipses the membership in the bogeyman group, then radicals will forever hold the reins of power. This is why radicals want to flood the country with illegal aliens. It's why they're encouraging more people to come out of the closet as gay. It's why they're constantly telling blacks the lie that racism is still widespread. It's why they're against assimilation and aspirations for transracial national identity. It's why they're constantly telling women that retrogrades want to strip them of civil rights. They need to grow their coalition so that, in the aggregate, it becomes more numerous than the retrograde bloc. This is how radicals grow and mollify their base, at the expense of the unity and confraternity of the nation. In their lust for power, radicals need to divide the country so that they can vanquish the old order, represented in caricature by the straight white male. But retrogrades may not do this in reverse. We have too much honor. We are prohibited in conscience from drawing on the schadenfreude and resentment that the have-nots harbor for the haves. We are prohibited from stoking provincial inter-race and intersex rivalries in an attempt to benefit our political cause. We're prohibited from floating ourselves on the chests of drowning men. The retrograde may not incite his brothers against one another, attempting to build unity through division. We may not rob Peter to pay Paul in order to win hearts and minds. A faction bound together only by the hatred of a common enemy is dysfunctional to the core. While the pessimistic strategy of incitement does work to produce cheap political wins, it's why radicals use this method, the morally upright retrograde method is a juggernaut in its own right. Our strength lies in the fact that our worldview is the correct one, and in the fact that truth is on our side. The human intellect was made by God so that men could come to know truth. The intellect, therefore, has a natural affinity for the truth. For mankind, truth is intrinsically attractive per se. Those opposed to truth have to use cheap gimmicks and deception of every stripe to attract followers, but not retrogrades. All we need is a platform from which to speak and ready ears and open hearts in our listeners. If retrogrades speak the truth boldly, never being cowed into silence, never allowing radicals to dictate what we can and can't say, we will win the culture and retain our honor in the process. In the end, tawdry gimmicks are no match for gritty substance.
And that was Rule 35 for Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left. Now, one of the mistakes that he makes is when you're doing rules like this, he makes the mistake, so does Steve Deese, is you've got to separate, there's two different types of conservatives, and you've got to separate them out. There's the public conservative and the private conservative. The public conservative is the office holder. Okay, your senator, your representative, those are public conservatives. They're in the public eye, and they're doing things in public. They're promoting bills, etc. The private conservatives, the rest of us. We are not public people, and we get up, we go to work, we raise our families, etc. So what you need to know for this particular rule, what he was talking about, applies to public conservatives only. Think about it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
I don't make it a habit of calling my friends and family members and asking them who they had sex with last night, I said, as if their private sexual behavior was none of my business. Like Bill Paxton said in the movie Aliens, game over, man! The entire faulty premise of the homosexual agenda is that what two consenting adults are doing in their bedroom is of no business to anybody else. In reality, the motto of this movement is, you will be made to care. That's why they make it our business by invading the public policy arena, demanding validation for their private bedroom behavior in a manner that compels the rest of us to alter our morality and religious freedom to accommodate them. By forcing the interviewer to pester me to the point he had no choice but to abandon the liberal talking points and invade my family's privacy, I had reversed his faulty premise and used it against him. Even better, this all happened in less than 90 seconds, so it kept everyone's attention. After the interview, Dick Bott of Bott Radio Network, a legend in Christian broadcasting, called me to tell me that was about the best defense of our belief system in 3 minutes he'd ever seen. I was faced with a similar situation on another issue during a nationally televised interview I did during the 2012 presidential primary. I was challenged by the interviewer with how I, as a Christian, could talk about grace and love while at the same time argue to end government programs to help the poor and needy. Again, this is the sort of question that all too often the Mitt McCains and George McDoles face from the national media that produces that cringe-inducing response. But if you have a solid worldview, it's like sitting on a fastball with a 3-1 count. I think grace and love are measured in a culture not by how many people are in need of government assistance, but by how many people no longer do, I said. What can be more loving than encouraging your fellow man, created in the image of God, that with the right training, tools, and opportunity, they can rise above their circumstances and fulfill their God-given potential? There was no follow-up question after that. If the welfare state really meant compassion, then how come Democrats aren't bragging about the fact there are currently more Americans on food stamps than the population of Spain? Shouldn't they be thanking the taxpayers for all this compassion? Shouldn't they be holding press junkets to boast their plan is working and we're the most compassionate society we've ever been? Instead of screaming, swearing, and throwing things at the TV while Republicrats roll over and play dead for the liberal media, we'd be standing and applauding if more conservatives in the spotlight said things like this more often. Remember when Newt Gingrich got a standing ovation at the 2012 South Carolina primary debate when he turned the tables just like that on Fox News' Juan Williams? Now, one of the most devastating ways to deploy premise reversal is with the use of humor, especially of the snarky variety. I will often use stories going viral as an opportunity to hoist the left from its own petard. Case in point is the strange tale of Raymond Foley. The 59-year-old Foley was charged with, get this, chair wetting. After hours at work, he was urinating on the chairs of the women he found attractive. In response to this story, I opened my show one night with this monologue. Raymond Foley is a victim. Sure, in past eras far less enlightened and tolerant as this current gilded age, Foley might be considered a menace to society, a creep even. But we know better now, don't we? We know people just can't control their urges, and to demand otherwise is a Neanderthal concept right out of the Stone Age. Foley was born with something that compels him to act out in ways some segments of our society, still clinging to their guns and religion, condemn. But what Foley doesn't need is judgment. Foley needs understanding. Foley, 59, was recently charged with second-degree mischief for simply being who he is. Who is Foley? Foley is a chair wetter. According to police in Iowa, Foley was looking up his fellow females employees in the Farm Bureau company database. If he found the woman attractive, he would then go to her desk after hours and urinate on her empty chair. For months, several female employees were complaining about a strange scent emanating from their chairs. Eventually, it was discovered the smell was that of urine, and the urine was Foley's. Once forced to come out of the closet, Foley clearly felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders because he voluntarily surrendered to police. No longer having to hide who he is, Foley is willing to accept responsibility for his admittedly odd actions. We can only hope that Foley will simultaneously seek to raise awareness of them as well. That's because Foley is just the most high-profile example of the latest progressive form of self-expression. Foley, like an increasing number of Americans, has discovered that he has a urination orientation. Shamed by society, folks like Foley have been forced to act on their urges in the shadows. Whether it's urinating on empty chairs or perhaps overindulging their senses via depictions of urinations on adult websites, Foley and others like him are being denied their right to urinate. It is, after all, the way they were made. All of us have the desire to urinate. It's part of our base nature. But where does someone else get off, so to speak, telling someone else what form that urination must take? Or even where that urination must take place? Laws that deny public expression of urination are just another example of the government regulating what we do with our own bodies. Until these laws are repealed and people like Foley affirmed in their right to urinate on whichever consenting adult or inanimate object they choose, none of us can trust our rights will be defended. For if one group is denied their freedom, then it's just a matter of time before straight shooters, slang for those who prefer to urinate into toilets, or on them, depending on their aim, they'll also be threatened. Some of you are sure to be offended by what Foley has done, but how dare you judge Foley until you've walked a mile in his shoes, or spent some time sitting in his chair? Besides, someone cannot change the way they were born, thus it's not right to shun Foley simply for acting on his nature. The chairs were empty, remember, and surely the urine dried by the time the women returned to work the next morning. Foley wasn't doing anything that harmed anybody else, and it's not like you can spread some disease via airborne urine. If that reasoned argument doesn't persuade you, then answer this simple question. How has Foley being able to act on his urination orientation negatively impacted your urination? If it hasn't impeded your stream of consciousness, so to speak, then what Foley is doing is none of your business, and you should urinate when and where you choose and permit Foley to do the same. Granted, the chairs Foley was urinating on were someone else's property, but that's simply because neither his employer nor the government provided the means by which Foley could properly apply his urination orientation. If Foley had access to chairs pretty girls once set in to urinate on, he wouldn't have to urinate on the chairs he actually did. That's not even addressing the fact that if the government doesn't provide Foley chairs to urinate in, he'll continue doing it after hours in chairs that could be faulty. Faulty chairs may collapse, thus putting Foley in jeopardy. We don't want people being harmed by collapsing chairs in back hallways, do we? That's exactly why the state ought to be providing those chairs for Foley and others like him. It could potentially save lives, not to mention some chairs, which is good for the environment. Then the state should make sure the next generation of kids in our schools doesn't succumb to the same intolerance and lack of diversity towards urination orientation that their fundamentalist parents and grandparents have victimized folks like Foley with. Furthermore, the company Foley used to work for should not only give him his job back, but also provide employees such as Foley a urination station to be utilized when the urge strikes. Of course, adding language to the company diversity curriculum, informing Foley's coworkers of the vital necessity of recognizing urination orientation in the workplace and the important contributions to society urinators have made throughout human history. Think of how many people in history have been bedwetters, for example. Should be immediate actions any good corporate citizen would immediately agree to. Given the fact a company like Farm Bureau would prefer to avoid looking like an agent of intolerance in the media, I'm confident it will do exactly that. Some of you reading this will bristle at recognizing both the normalcy and necessity of people like Foley being affirmed and accepted for just being who they are, but many of you also bristled at things 20 years ago you're readily accepting now. Nevertheless, even if those questioning or struggling with their urination orientation aren't accepted by your generation, rest assured they will be by your children once we're through enlightening them. Soon you will see more urination in your classrooms, and all of the best and most likable characters on your most popular television shows will urinate freely on screen. We'll even have clergy arguing that the Bible affirms urination in all of its forms. And we'll have a pioneer like Foley to thank for that. Who knows, maybe Sean Penn will even play the part of Foley in his biopic one day. D.L. Moody once said, "When you win some, you win some." In addition, there's an old saying which goes, "What the devil hates most of all is to be mocked."
And that was part 2 of Chapter 6 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. And he's talking again. His audience here is not me and you. His audience is public conservatives. Okay, because I'm not going to pay attention to any of this. His sarcasm, this whole sarcastic thing is lost on me. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with it. I'm sure, am I supposed to take notes of some sort? And then what? What about it's great for you. He says he opened a show with this. Well, good for you. You got a show. And for other people that have a show, this might be worth listening to and paying attention to. What about the rest of the rank and file conservatives in the United States that don't have a show? How is this supposed to help them? No answer. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
But I would always ask them at some point, how come you guys want to get married in church? And they'd usually say some version of, Well, because we love each other. And I would say, well, that's great. I'm delighted you love each other. But that's not reason to get married in church. Two people in love can get married on the beach in front of the Justice of the Peace. You get married in church when you're convinced that God has brought you together for his purposes. So the people gathered the other day for my niece's wedding would say this young couple did not come together just by dumb chance, but rather they were brought together by God's providence for God's purposes. And that's what we were celebrating that day in church.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand quote of the day.
You have no faith in anything.
Faith?
Only in your mind.
That is not faith. That is a conviction. Yes, I have no faith at all. I only hold convictions.
And that was Ayn Rand's quote of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Stuart-Varney.
And Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise Jim Jordan has a lot more than 4%. Okay, and so he concluded we're further behind than when we kicked out Kevin McCarthy. He's like, we're nowhere near a solution. And he said he's not sure we're going to have anything by noon today or beyond. And he even said, look, I'm still voting for Jim Jordan. So even though Jim Jordan himself said everybody vote for Steve Scalise. So I took away from that interview, we're in a pickle, and this pickle is not getting better. It is a really bad situation, and it's not getting better, Stu.
And you can't aid Israel, Ukraine, until you've got a speaker to get something done.
And you'd think that the events of the last week would have expedited stuff? Not so.
Not so.
So there you go. These are morons, a couple of morons. Stuart-Varney, the hideous guy from England, and his guest, one of his permanent guests, are a couple of morons. The left is making as much. The left loves everything that's going on. They love the war in Hamas. They love what's going on in the House of Representatives. They love what's going on at the border. They love the inflation. They love out of control spending. They love it. Why? Because their mission is to convince the average American that democracy is dead, that democracy doesn't work, that democracy equals chaos. It's not hard for us to draw that conclusion, because think about it. We voted for all of this. We voted for Joe Biden, a man who can't even find his way off the stage. We voted for his foreign policy, which leads to the war in Israel, and we voted for his policies that created inflation, etc., etc. It was all legit and voted for. So these idiots, when they come along and say, oh, look at the chaos in the Republican Party in the House, all they do is add fuel to the chaos fire. All they do is they end up mocking democracy and encouraging the average American to desire authoritarian government. And they're stupid. They're just so damn stupid and greedy. Part of this also is just greed. They want their for-profit news. They don't care who they hurt in the process, just so long as they get their profits. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Ron DeSantis is a guest of Joe, I think it's called Cup of Joe or something, on MSNBC of all places.
Well, I'll tell you, Joe, I'm actually down in Ball Harbor. We just did an event at the Shoal here, and it's raw for our community down in South Florida. We have the second biggest Israeli-American community in the country. We have a large Jewish population that's really expanded a lot in the last few years, particularly with the Orthodox Jews. So everybody knows somebody who's been over there. People know people that are missing, and unfortunately, people know people that have been killed. This is perhaps Israel's darkest hour. This is a country that had to fight for its inception in the late 1940s. The Arab armies wanted to extinguish it in the crib. Then they were going to get invaded in 67, and they preempted that in the Six-Day War. Then they did get invaded with the Yom Kippur War, and they were able to win that. And then they faced intifada after intifada. And then the level of barbarity, it's hard to comprehend. The images and the videos are absolutely disgusting. And I just think it's important as Americans that we all come together. Israel has a right to defend itself, and that means do that to the hilt. You have to uproot the terrorist infrastructure, these networks, and Hamas needs to be no more. I fear what happens in these situations is, people say Israel can respond. Then a week later, then 2 weeks later, then people start to blame Israel. There's no moral equivalence between a Hamas terrorist and an Israeli civilian, and they have every right to see this through to the hilt. Well, I'll tell you, Joe.
And that was Ron DeSantis on MSNBC. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart-Varney's My Take.
Thursday morning, and now this. It's worth remembering how President Trump dealt with Iran. It stands in stark contrast with President Biden. Trump told the mullahs if they killed a single American, the U.S. would respond with military power. It was a red line. Hey, don't cross it. As Mark Thiessen details today in the Washington Post, at first, the mullahs stayed within the red line. Trump was restrained, but then Tehran miscalculated. Iranian proxies killed an American military contractor. Trump promptly attacked Hezbollah targets, and then he droned Iran's terror chief, Qasem Soleimani, killed him. Trump then warned the Iranians that if they retaliated, quote, Iran itself would be hit very hard and very fast, end quote, his words. Iran backed off, and Trump then brokered peace agreements between Israel and 4 Arab nations. Biden squandered the stability that Trump had brought to the Mideast. He tried to reopen the nuclear deal. He relaxed sanctions and allowed Iran to produce and sell 3 million barrels of oil a day. Then he paid $1 billion apiece for the release of hostages. He showed appeasement and weakness. And now Iran is behind the terror attack on Israel. Americans have been killed. Americans have been taken hostage. This is what Trump said just a few days ago. Quote, the horrible attack on Israel, much like the attack on Ukraine, would never have happened if I were president. Zero chance. The man has a point, doesn't he? Jason Chaffetz with me now. Is Biden's weakness to blame for this attack?
And that was Stuart-Varney's My Take. Back in a minute. Thank you. So on the Israel, the war that Israel is engaged in, although I don't know that their parliament has actually declared war, but in any case, this what they call a war. It doesn't look good for Israel. It really doesn't. Because I've seen this before. I've seen this play out before when there was a Soviet Union. During the days of the Soviet Union, it was the Soviet Union that funded Hamas and Hezbollah and other organizations like that, trying to destabilize Israel. And it was always the same pattern. Hezbollah or whoever would shoot rockets into Israel, kill people. Israel would then retaliate. Then there would be a negotiated settlement. There would be a negotiated settlement, and Hamas or Hezbollah would be the victor. They would win because they would appear to defeat a major power. Because all Hezbollah or Hamas have to do is survive. If they can survive, they can come out the other end and their leadership is intact, and they still have their cabinet meetings and their flag and all that other stuff, they win. They win. Now, how is it that they were able to do that? They were able to win again and again. This would happen again and again and again and again. Then we started seeing some progress because the Soviet Union disappeared, vanished. So all the money that was going to Hezbollah dries up. So now they've got to find another source. That's when they went to Iran. But what was the dynamics of it? It's always the same, is that it was about hostages and civilians. That's the way that what they would do is encourage the Israelis to hamper their own military operations. And they were able to do this, Hamas was, because they had allies in the news media. And Israel has never understood that their biggest enemy is not Hamas, it's not Hezbollah, it's not even Iran. Their biggest enemy is Al Jazeera, CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News, AP, UPI, Reuters. All of those news agencies hate Israel and want to see Israel defeated. Now, they don't have any armies, of course, so there's not much they can do about it. But what they can do is play psychological games with Israeli leadership. And the way they do that is with hostages and civilians. As soon as Hamas starts destroying people in Israel, immediately the news media starts wringing its hands. Oh my gosh, what about the hostages? Oh my gosh, what about the civilians? What about the poor civilians? This is the crucial point. This is the place where the war is going to be won or lost. If Israel acknowledges that there's hostages publicly, they can do so privately if they want to. There's no problem with that. But if they do so publicly, and they acknowledge that there are civilians in Gaza, and they do so publicly, they've just tied their own hands. They've guaranteed a victory for Hamas and or Hezbollah. This is part of the reason why these folks are so bold, because they know that the news media is their, I don't know, what do they call fifth column for the terrorists. They're not neutral, the news media, even though they pretend to be. They are on the side of the terrorists, and still, Israel's been through this again and again and again and again over the years, and still Israel is blind to the fact that the news media will tie their hands, force them into a negotiated settlement, and Hamas and Hezbollah can claim victory. And shame on Israel for making this mistake over and over again. What does it say? They say, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Well, what happens when they fool you 50 times? Then what? So I hope that Israel is going to be able to have the gumption to do what needs to be done here, despite the fact that they've already publicly come out and admitted that there's hostages and that there are civilians. Because with the civilians, part of the dynamic is, what you've seen is, first they say, well, they're civilians, the news media does. Then Hezbollah says, well, we'll kill hostages if you don't warn us about your attacks. Well, you can't be an effective military force if you're signaling your intentions to your enemy. Hey, Mr. Enemy over there, we're going to attack in about 5 seconds. Then they're just going to flee. The combat people all take off. They may leave civilians behind as some sort of a shield. It's just stupid. It becomes kabuki theater. So, again, shame on Israel for not seeing this. Shame on the United States also for not seeing this as well. But it'll be interesting to see if they have what it takes to overcome. They may just decide, we don't care, we're going to just go in there and kick some butt anyways. But I doubt it. I think it's going to end up being a negotiated settlement, and Israel will appear to the world to have lost again, Hezbollah and Hamas will be have appeared to the world to have won yet again and will be further emboldened to commit more atrocities. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, inside Delta Force.
It wasn't taken lightly, and it wasn't funny. Short of shooting a comrade, it was about the worst mistake you could make. We were training to rescue hostages, and if we couldn't keep from hitting them in a fight, we weren't doing our job. If we were no better than that, then a squad of infantry could do the job. They could just go in and kill everybody. We worked at this for over a month. 1 solid month on the range. At the end of the day, we would put our weapons and equipment on the truck, change into running kit, and run back to the compound a little more than 5 miles away. It was a good way to bleed off the intensity of the day. When we got in, we would clean weapons, talk about the day, clean ourselves, go home, and come back to do it again the next day. Everyone sees rapid improvement in his shooting ability at first. Then you reach a sort of plateau where improvement seems slow and incremental. After that, every gain is made by working on the finer points of technique. By this time, we were splitting hairs with our shooting. And then we were introduced to the shooting house, where we'd spend 8 hours a day for the next month. The shooting house was back at the compound. In fact, it was just out the back door from our OTC bay. I had helped build it, putting up drywall just before we started OTC, and the guys ahead of us in the unit were already shooting there several hours a day. That original shooting house was a simple affair with 4 rooms, 2 on each side and a central corridor down the middle. Each room's lighting could be controlled from the hallway and raised or lowered as needed. 3 of the rooms could be set up to resemble almost any type of dwelling, office, or warehouse space. The 4th room was the aircraft room, a section of aircraft fuselage complete with airplane doors, passenger seats, and overhead luggage bins. The place was ruggedly constructed to withstand the impact of all the bullets and explosives used inside. The door frames in each room were made of heavy timbers and slightly recessed, so we could breach them with explosives and then put up new doors. There was a central ventilation system to pull out the smoke, but unfortunately it pulled air in at the bottom of the walls and exhausted it through the ceilings, so a lot of lead dust and vapors went right up our noses. We changed the ventilation when we realized the problem, but within a year, several guys had dangerously high concentrations of lead and had to limit their time in the shooting house. The shooting house could be a very eerie place. The day our instructors took us in for an introduction was a real eye-opener. Each room was furnished differently. One was like an office, one was like a living room, one was an industrial setting, and of course there was the aircraft room. It looked so real, it was weird. The furniture was new, the carpets were clean, and the place was peopled with mannequins in natural poses and dress. Some were terrorists, and others were hostages. There were even children. If I hadn't realized before how serious this business was, I sure knew it now. This was where all of our range work came together. In the shooting house, we added tactics to shooting. The formula became infinitely more complicated and hazardous. our instructors demonstrated, with live fire. Our OTC class, all 23 of us, was taken into the big room of the shooting house. Some were seated on the sofa, some sat around a card table, more were scattered around the corners, and the rest stood in the center of the room. Intermingled among us were bad guys, FBI silhouette targets in the shape of a man holding a pistol. Bill, our chief shooting instructor, placed a handheld radio on the table in the center of the room and told us to listen carefully when the radio came on. Then he stepped outside and closed the door. Seconds later, the radio crackled to life with these words: "I have control. Stand by. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Execute, execute, execute." What happened next was so fast it was impossible to follow. The room erupted in noise and violent action. On that first execute, the door to the room blasted open, and I could see Alan coming through at a run. At the very instant he came in, something flew from his hand toward the ceiling at the center of the room and exploded. I tried to watch the team as they came in, but my eye, and everyone else's, had been irresistibly drawn to that flying flashbang. When it exploded above our heads, I hardly heard the pistols and submachine guns going off all around us. I was stunned motionless. It was over in less than 3 seconds. Our instructors were posted all about the room. Alan was in one corner, and Mike was in the opposite diagonal corner. Bob was just to the left of the door, and Bill was just to the right. Smoke hung in the air, and I could taste the acrid fumes of the flashbang in the back of my throat. Bill looked to Alan and said, "Search." Weapon at the ready, Alan moved over the sector of the room he had assaulted, checking the dead terrorists for signs of life. Bill covered while he checked each target, and then returned to his position in the corner. When Alan was back in position, he gave Bill an affirmative nod, and Bill shifted his attention to Mike, giving him the same command. Bob covered Mike as he checked the dead, and twice Bob moved a step forward or to the side so that he could easily cover a target while Mike checked it. Mike never stepped in front of an unchecked target in a way that would have prevented Bob from shooting if he had to. I looked around the room and saw that each terrorist had 2 bullet holes in a vital spot, either the head, the center of the chest, or the throat. How the hell had they done that with us all around the room and intermingled with the targets? It seemed impossible that all those bullets missed us. Someone should have been hit, but we were all whole and unperforated. It was unreal. Bill asked, "Did everybody see what happened during the assault?" "Hell no, Bill," somebody croaked. "All we saw was that damned flashbang, and then you guys were in here." "That's the way it's supposed to work," replied Bill. "Now we'll do it again at a walking pace, and I'll explain it as we go along." Under normal conditions, we would have blown the door with explosives, but in this case, it would have been too much of a distraction. As Bill spoke, Alan walked through the room in demonstration. "The first man in the room, the number 1 man, threw the flashbang," said Bill, and made an instant decision to turn left. He did that because the left side was the heavy side of the room, meaning that there were more people on that side than on the other. It could also mean that it was a longer side of the room. You'll learn more about that later. The number 1 man always goes to the heavy side, which usually means the more dangerous side. Alan was walking the left side of the room, simulating shooting the targets he had engaged on the live fire run-through. Staying close to the wall, he goes down that side of the room, engaging any targets in that area. He turns at the corner and goes down that wall, still engaging targets. He halts at the far corner and faces back into the room. We all looked at Alan. On the first time through, did anyone follow Alan until he stopped in his corner? Bill asked innocently, though he knew the answer. We all shook our heads. "Why not?" he asked. Several people said they'd been distracted by the flashbang. Guy Harmon gave another reason. "I tried to watch him," he said, "but instead I noticed Mike coming in right on top of Alan. But Mike turned right, and that drew my attention away." "Did you see him shoot?" Bill asked. "No, I didn't. said Guy. I knew he was shooting, but I was making myself small and covering up. My mind was on surviving. Bill nodded, okay, and then he continued. Mike came in right on top of Alan, but he turned right when Alan went left. Mike immediately engaged the targets on the far wall opposite the door, then went down the wall to the first corner, turned, and came to a halt, watching into the corner farther down the wall and out into the center of the room. Mike walked through each step as Bill narrated. Do you see what happened here? It's impossible to keep an eye on movement in opposite directions. If you're the terrorist, you can't keep up with what's going on because your attention is divided, and fatally so. But the assaulter is only concerned with what's in front of him in his sector of the room. Who saw me and Bob as we entered the room? He asked. No one really had. When the shooting stopped, I noticed they were in the room on either side of the doorway. I had felt their presence, but didn't really see them until the action stopped. Bill went on with his explanation. Rather than pile in right on top of the first two men, we hesitated a split second before entering the room. That way, the attention of the terrorists was no longer on the door, but on the two men in the room, who were still on the move. With attention drawn away from the door, numbers 1 and 2 men kept moving, we came in unnoticed. I went to the heavy side and started engaging targets in that area to assist the number 1 man. I worked from the center of the room to the left. Bob stepped to the other side and worked from the center to the right. As he said this, they positioned themselves as described. It was perfect. Look at us now. Look at our positions and the areas we're covering. There's not a square inch of this room that's not covered by fire and observation. If a piece of furniture presents an obstacle to one man, at least 2 others can see and shoot around it. We have completely dominated the room. We own it and everyone in it. Had you men actually been hostages, Bill went on, as team leader, I would have started talking to you as soon as the shooting stopped. We want the hostages to stay calm and comply with our commands. We'll ask if they know of anyone or anything else in the room that is still a threat to their safety. We want to know if any terrorists are hiding in the room or among the hostages, and whether or not there are any explosives. But the last thing you ask is, are there any bombs in the place? We don't want to start a stampede. As if the flashbangs and submachine guns weren't enough. When we've determined everything is under control in here, I'll render a situation report to the troop commander. I'll tell him the room is clear, ask for medical assistance if we need it, and tell him we're prepared to evacuate the hostages. We'll continue to talk to and engage the attention of the hostages until they are moved out to the hostage holding area, where they will be initially questioned and identified. When the hostages are out, we brief ourselves on what happened in the room. In turn, each team member demonstrates and explains his actions in the room. He'll recount where he went, who he shot, how many rounds he fired and where, and he'll account for each shot fired. Not until we all know exactly what the team did inside the room will I report to the troop commander that I'm ready to turn the room over to troop control. The only exception to this would be an emergency evacuation caused by, say, an uncontrolled fire or the discovery of explosives. Jimmy Masters raised his hand for a question. Jimmy, a Creek Indian from Oklahoma, was one of the sharpest men in the class. When he had a question or a comment, it was always valuable. Bill acknowledged him with a nod and said, Jim, I'm going to ask you and everyone else to hold the questions for now. We're going to take a break and reconvene back in the classroom. Colonel Beckwith wants to speak to you. Then we'll answer all your questions and take it from there. The shooting house is going to be your full-time home for the next month or so. Okay, that's it. Classroom in 15 minutes. And we were dismissed. Even though I had seen it up close, the room assault was hard to believe. The suddenness of it was astounding. One moment all was calm, then hell erupted, and just as suddenly, calm returned. There was a mental factor at work here that intrigued me. The assault team had exploded into action when they assaulted the room, but when it was concluded, they immediately went back to a very calm, controlled mental state. It appeared seamless. They didn't have to stop after their explosion of intensity and regain their composure. They went smoothly from one mode to the other. They knew when to rush and when to go slow, but their self-control never deserted them. They never became overly or visibly excited, as most men would have. I could now see where all those shooting drills were leading us. If we stopped right now, we would be damned good combat shooters, infinitely better than any other military unit I knew of. But this next phase of training would take us to an altogether different level. And deep in the core of my being was a kernel of dread. Could I do that? Could I shoot that close to another person and run the risk of killing an innocent hostage or one of my mates? The honest answer was, not yet. My skills were close, but my confidence wasn't.
And that was the next part of Preparing the Force from Inside Delta Force by Command Sergeant Major Eric L. Haney, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.